Why do Christians love Israel? Now, that's an interesting question. American Christians in particular, especially evangelical Protestants, seem to love Israel. And the reason that they give usually has something to do with, Bible prophecy and end times, Israel having to be restored in order for the second coming of Jesus and all that other stuff. But it's really interesting how deeply this Christian Zionism has taken root in a lot of American churches. To the point where their loyalty to Israel or their love for Israel seems to be much greater than their loyalty or their love for Christians and Christianity. So, Christians may have been as much as 10% of the Palestinian population prior to the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, in which Israel gained independence. And many of them packed up and left as a result of that war, or were displaced as a result of that war, to where now the Christian population in Israel is about 2%, and in the Palestinian territories it's like up to possibly 2.5% in the West Bank and less than 1% in Gaza Strip. So most of the Palestinian Christians at this point, who are still 6 to 7% of the Palestinian population worldwide, are part of the diaspora. So they have been displaced to neighboring countries or moved to Europe or North America or Latin America. So it doesn't seem like the creation of Israel has been good for Christians in that region on the whole. And the 2% of Israeli citizens who are Christian, that population seems to be stable and maybe even growing now. But they still complain of discrimination in certain respects, or Christian clergy in Israel are often spat upon by ultra-Orthodox Jews. And there have been a number of attacks, vandalism and attacks, arson against churches and other Christian targets in Israel. So the population seems to be stable and growing, and maybe their status is fairly protected at this point, and standard of living is all right educationally. I think they do better than average in Israel, but it's not totally without issues. And obviously the Christians in the occupied territories face a lot of the same hardships as the Muslim Palestinians. So it's not clear why, supporting Israel is a very Christian thing to do, especially not to the extent that a lot of these people do, where they're just totally rabid supporters of Israel. Totally rabid and uncritical supporters of Israel. And especially, if you look at all the chaos that has been sown in neighboring countries, by Israel or on behalf of Israel, it never works out well for the Christians. Arguably the Iraq war waged by the U.S. was waged on behalf of Israel. Or at least it was, fomented by interests within the United States who were sympathetic to Israel and motivated largely or primarily by that sympathy or by that loyalty to Israel. The neoconservatives, the Project for the New American Century, those kind of people. Most of whose names echo. And there were 1.5 million Christians in Iraq before the war. And now anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of those have been killed or displaced by the violence since that war. And you've got a similar number of Christians in Syria, and a similar number displaced or killed by the violence in Syria. So even if Israel itself at this point is not particularly hostile to Christians, the process of the creation of Israel was fairly harmful and disruptive to Christians in Palestine. But at this point, maybe that settled down, and so Christians in Israel are no longer threatened, although they are occasionally harassed and even attacked, by hardline Jewish extremists. But their ongoing activities in neighboring countries, just incredibly disastrous for Christians. And this Christian Zionism, where Christians support Israel, rabidly and uncritically, has been criticized by the Jerusalem Declaration. So the representatives of the Latin, Roman Catholic Church and the Syriac Orthodox Church and the Episcopal Church and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jerusalem issued a declaration, condemning Christian Zionism as replacing the teachings of Jesus Christ with basically a political and military agenda, and criticizing it in those terms. And historically, Catholics have never been notably philo-Semitic. They've never been preoccupied with this idea of restoring a Jewish homeland or, advancing Jewish interests generally. It's never really been a big Catholic thing. It kind of has become a little bit of a Catholic thing since Vatican II, where they've really softened their historic positions quite a bit. And, maybe one of the clues here comes from that Second Vatican Council, where there actually was a Jewish convert in that council, John Osterreicher, who helped to soften some of the language, regarding Jews still further from where they were softening it. He wanted to make it even less, let's say, strident or judgmental. Or because, the Vatican II really softened the position of the Catholic Church towards the Jews, while maintaining an expectation that they eventually convert to Christianity. So, I don't know all the ins and outs. I'm not a Christian. I'm not well versed on the finer points of the theology here, but it seems like the Second Vatican Council really softened the position of the Catholic Church towards Jews in general, and they still retained the position that there's an expectation eventually for Jews to join the New Covenant or whatever. But this guy John Osterreicher, who is a Jewish convert to Catholicism, he helped to soften that even a little bit further by removing. They didn't completely remove the expectation, but they made it a lot weaker and more open-ended. And he helped with that. So, this kind of, I don't know if you would call it infiltration or subversion, that's occurred in the Catholic case, could certainly be going on in the Protestant case as well. And it's hard to conjure a reason why the Zionism would be so intense, or the philo-Semitism would be so intense without something like that going on. And, some Zionists actually say that they got the idea for Zionism from Christian Zionism, because there is a strain of it that goes back to Puritan times, before, organized political Zionism was really a thing. There was this Christian Zionism. I doubt they got the idea from the Christian Zionists. They probably got some support, and there was some exchange of ideas there. The idea of the Jews having their own state is not specifically a Christian idea. I'm sure there's a little bit of self-motivation there. Even if Christian Zionism has a longer history than organized Jewish Zionism. So these Christian Zionists, the Puritan ones or whatever, have traditionally maintained an expectation that, not only does Israel have to be restored for the second coming to occur and all this kind of stuff, but the Jews have to convert to Christianity because, Christianity is still the one true religion. The new covenant replaced the old covenant with Moses or Abraham, no, it was Moses, I guess. Abraham, whichever. I said I'm not clear on the finer points here. But there was this new covenant, and the historical norm was suprasessionism, meaning the new covenant supersedes the old covenant. So that was like the traditional Catholic doctrine. And now you have some people who are dual covenant theologians who maintain that both covenants are still valid. And, getting into theology is, I don't want to get down in the weeds there. But you have some guys like this John Hagee, who's an American televangelist, and he's involved with some kind of organization called CUFI, Cucks United for Israel. I think they call themselves Christians United for Israel, but it might as well be Cucks United for Israel. And, this guy actually maintains some pretty wild stuff, like that the Jewish covenant is still valid because Jesus Christ never claimed to be the Messiah. Now, I definitely don't want to get into splitting hairs about Christian theology, especially since I'm not even a Christian, but that seems to be just a bald outright lie within the context of Christian scripture, right? So that's more than just splitting hairs about theology. That's just making shit up. Just flatly contradicting your own scripture. So I don't know what the theological status of that is. But anyway, it's a really bizarre phenomenon that these Christians support Israel so rabidly and so uncritically, to their own detriment, to the detriment of other Christians in the Middle East, to the detriment of, other Christians around the world. Despite the criticisms of Christians in Jerusalem, for example, with this Jerusalem Declaration, it's just really bizarre. We've come to expect from Christians at this point that, they're going to put their religion ahead of their race, for example. They're not necessarily going to be more loyal to other whites or other Western cultures than they are to their religion. Whatever. We expect that from them. But this idea of putting another religion even over the interests of their own and the interests of their co-religionists, now that is really bizarre. That doesn't make any sense. And, I know how they rationalize it with the Bible prophecies and stuff, but, there's got to be something going on there. There's got to be some kind of infiltration and subversion going on there, because I don't see any other way for something like that to come about. And, Bible prophecy is notoriously, let's say, subject to abuse. There have been a lot of Bible prophets who have made a lot of wild predictions and gotten people to, sell their stuff and gather on mountaintops, and it turns out nothing ever happened. And, other scams that are even more outright and outrageous than that. I saw an ad on Facebook the other day for some kind of oil drilling venture in Israel that was trying to get people to buy bonds in this oil drilling project, and the whole thing was justified based on Bible prophecy. And I'm like, are you serious? How gullible do you think I am? Like, first of all, for all the oil you're going to hit, you might as well just not even do the drilling. And they probably aren't. Why would you? But, to try to sell a business venture like that on Bible prophecy, it's something that's subject to abuse is all I'm saying. And that's probably what's going on here.